Lucas, thanks for joining me here. You got the memo on the gray shirt and not having hair side of things. We're here to talk about experimentation, centers of excellence.
I
You
shaved
have,
just for you, man.
yeah, we both have good heads for it, I guess. That's what tell myself.
This wasn't by choice. I had no options.
Yeah, you still should be proud on how you handled it, I guess.
Thank you.
Um, I want to talk about centers of excellence, experimentation program centers of excellence. We've got some
Cool.
blueprints on organization structures. There's resources out there, including from yourself, on what you're messing with right now on the
Yeah.
experimentation hubs over at Vista. You've seen it in action, over, of course, over at Booking and things like that. I've got four questions to help anchor us and to make this pretty concise and see what we get out of it.
Cool.
So my first question: where are you now with the testing program COE? Like you, before we got started recording, you mentioned that you're having a change of point of view there.
Yeah.
I've definitely done the same, but where are you now with experimentation program centers of excellence? And you can take that question from the standpoint of like you're building one now and you want to talk about the struggles you're in now, or you can
Mm.
take it from more agnostic around where you are now, just in terms of your viewpoint on centers of excellence to
Cool.
facilitate experimentation programs.
Ooh, that is, I mean, you say that's a nice and pointed question. It's actually super broad, so
It is a
that's
bit
fine.
broad. Well, it was meant to be surgical around where are you now in the struggles that you're working with in your current program. So it was
So,
supposed to be like that, but yeah, I
so
broadened it.
rewind the clock a little bit. Like I was running what I don't know, I was product lead for I think 20 to 30 people at Booking. So it was a pretty large org. Uh, and you could call them a center of excellence, but we thought of ourselves as a product team or four product teams, um, with PMs, devs, and designers, copywriters, like in the same team, also doing the training, also doing all of the sort of facilitating the peer review and stuff like that. And I very deliberately left that because I wanted to see what it was like to join a company that didn't have that much context already, right? So a company that does have the desire to experiment, that does have some sort of ground foundational work, especially in terms of like leadership buy-in. But
To be to
then,
be to
yeah,
jump in on there real quick on that story, you were four product teams. Were you on top of those four product teams or within one of the four that was
I,
facilitating it?
yeah.
That's
So
important
this, I
because
mean,
that's
standards. I don't know if you know about the standard. We'll talk about this later. But standard empowered product team model, which is you have a three-legged stool of a design leader, an engineering leader, and a product leader for
mm,
each team,
yep.
and then you have a bunch of additional engineers usually, and that becomes an empowered product team. The way you usually lead that is that the empowered product teams, the engineers report into the engineering manager on the team, and then the engineering managers of all the teams report into a domain leader or a group leader. Um, and so, uh, and on the product side, that's usually called a group product manager because they are the first managing layer in the product space. Because in engineering, that happens within the team, right? You're a developer, you become an engineering manager within the same team, and then you can step up and become a domain engineering later. But on the product side, that's usually a group product manager. In my case, I was a director, so one level up because the scope of the product is so broad because it's across the entire organization. But I was essentially acting as a group product manager within that uh, group of teams. So there were four teams, four. I have to say this correctly: three or four product managers, three product managers. Um, and then me as their. So I was managing the product managers. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
nice. I'm familiar with that setup. There's a bank in the U.S. that I'm talking to around centers of excellence that they have 100 of those squads, 100 product teams.
Wow.
I know, like
It gets interesting when you start bunching them, I think. Like that, I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
the engine of this system, I think, can work really well if you have these individual teams. It gets way more complicated when you start thinking about how do you group them into sensical units and how do you lead them. And so one thing that Booking was sort of wavering between was, do you have it was called a three-legged stool, or in my case, two-legged, right? So an engineering lead and a product lead. So Roderick was the engineering lead, I was a product lead, and together we lead the track or the tribe or whatever you want to call it.
We'll get back to
In
that.
Vista's
Have a
case,
good
yeah, in
opportunity.
Vista's case, they add to design to that. So each domain, as they call it, has a product lead, a design lead, and an engineering lead. Booking also had places where there was only a single threaded leader. So there was only one leader for the entire thing, which means that there's one leader who leads engineering and product and design, which is an interesting space to be in.
Mm. On your current setup, at least you published some work on the experimentation hub having this like almost like AM function of like training and ambassadorship, evangelism, and then the second is like the product side of like the engineering. When you were
Yeah.
this two-legged kind of team, did you look at yourself like that? Like one person was in charge of like the training from the product side, I would say, and then the other person was in charge of like the data architecture and the systems support
Within
and the technical
within
support.
Booking,
Yeah, I
are you
guess,
asking about Booking now? Yeah.
but but
So
but 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 the material that I take this from is actually what you've published from Vista.
from Vista,
So
yeah.
from Vista, yeah,
Yeah. So let me talk about Booking first. Roderick and I, so engineering leader and product leader, we alternated doing the training,
yeah.
and that was mostly historical. So this was because we both like when we started, it was only one team, and I was the product lead and he was the engineering lead, or he was actually a data scientist in the beginning, but he became engineering lead. And so we were alternating the training. That was mostly historical. I think as we sort of tried to wean ourselves off of this, we considered like, do we want to make this the responsibility of the entire group of teams, or do we want to have a separate team, probably analysts, who have a tendency to educate well? And do we want them to run this sort of basic experimentation training? We also had developer training. So there was also developers in that same group that were doing the training for developers, which was mostly around implementation. But for sort of the statistics and hypothesis testing and all those things, like we were thinking about putting it within the analytics team. Vista, because we started much smaller, I didn't work with teams. I had to work with humans, right? So I sort of trying to replicate the same system at a much smaller level. So when I joined, there were two analysts, and the first thing I wanted was to add developers, because I think analysts are great, but if you want to sort of build production ready systems and tooling and sort of glue things together and sort of run things at scale, then you need developers working together with analysts. So we bundled the analysts and the developers as one empowered team, and then added a PM. So I hired Kevin Anderson as a product manager, because I think that running a center of excellence, you risk becoming, I don't know, like the chiefs on the high mountain, without thinking like, how is this actually landing in the organization? Like, how are people actually using this? What are they struggling with? And that's the kind of thing that the product manager can really sort of think about. And so I hired Kevin Anderson and basically told him like, all of our internal users are your customers, and you have to go figure out what's stopping them from running more experiments. And so that's why I hired a product manager for the team. And then I hired Sarah Butov, specifically because she has a background in research and she has experience educating, building training programs. And so rather than put this in a team, I said, well, we're going to hire specifically for that skill, because one of the friction points we saw is that people just didn't know how to do it. So we hired Sarah specifically for that need.
Nice.
Does that answer
So
your question?
yeah, it did, and it bridged over to the next two questions. I was asking about like how did you get there, some of the journey. That's what you went into right away. My third question though, I'll retain. You mentioned I like the milestones of like hire this, then that.
Yeah.
But any other key milestones, rituals, artifacts? You mentioned the people side of things,
Yeah.
but on that journey at Vista, like any other key milestones that stick out to you as being important?
So when I joined, and I think I need to give credit to Flavio here. So when I joined, Flavio was already there. He was working with one other analyst. And they were at that point creating a set of examples. So they had run several experiments already. And one of the things they wanted was to create like a seed set of like, here's what a good experiment looks like, right? Here's the kind of documentation you write. Here's the kind of analysis you do. Here's the way you share it. Here's the way you document it. And so that was, I think, was a milestone, because it allowed us to go like, hey, this is what we're looking at, right? This is how how you execute, but also how does it influence decision making, right? So it really needed a bunch of examples. I think the next milestone was sort of building enough buy-in for seeding that team, because obviously I wanted to hire a few people, so I needed to explain why. I think that's where the blog post about building a culture and the sort of the organization, organizing for scaled experimentation, that especially the second one, we talk about like what is the organizational model that we're going to use. This idea of a hub and spoke, of having sort of decentralized decision making and centralized enablement. So a single team that tries to help other people run experiments rather than run experiments themselves. That is something that I needed to explain, right? So we wrote the North Star document and said, like, here's what our operating model is going to look like. Here's how we want to run it, and that's why we need to hire these people. So I think that was an important milestone. Then there was a lot of technical enablement, I think. So they did have good tech already, but not all of it was set up to run experiments very effectively. So we had to think about like, how do we technically make ourselves faster at setting up these tests? Then there was some hand wringing around how, like, what is the best process for documenting these things? Because and I think we got ahead of ourselves here, honestly. Like, we were thinking about like, once we were running 1,000 tests, people won't be able to find the old tests, right? But we weren't there, so we were trying to solve a problem that didn't exist yet. And if I sort of look back, I wonder whether we wasted or we spun our wheels a little bit too much on that side of things. It is a constant iteration, though, right? You have to look at, like, are people actually documenting? Are they documenting things that make sense? Like, why are they documenting these things and not those things? So it is a constant. That's why you hire a PM. Basically,
I want to poke on where you might have had struggles, like going into one team versus another, and I'll do it by giving away. And this is my last question here, but and I'm going to ask this question, and I'll provide you context from where I come from a little bit and where I'm changing my viewpoint. As you go and work with other teams, those other teams are focused in other parts of the growth model, so to speak. And I take a lot from Elena Verna and what she's published, and I put it together with like a recent material of Shagan at American Express, which I can share with you. She did a talk on speaking the language of different teams and specifically leaders, and they didn't care about conversion rates or click-through rates or anything like that. They cared about CSAT. There's like customer, metric, and I'm thinking about, a goal tree map for a centralized program is a pretty typical goal tree map for like e-commerce. You might have like revenue, and then underneath that like AOV and transactions, and then below that you've got other like click-through rates and stuff, whatever. But for a center of excellence, I think that the goal tree map is different. It should be the language in which the teams are in themselves. And so if you go over to like the acquisition team versus retention team, they've got the different language set. And so part of where I'm shifting my brain is the use of these goal tree maps and how they look. And then, so that's the context in which I want to ask the question of like, did you have struggles going to some of these teams, and what language maybe, talk about that struggle? Does what I mentioned around goal tree maps resonate at all? Did that come into play? Speak to that.
Interesting. So I think I've encountered different problems, and I think the reason I'm changing my mind is that one thing I did not realize when I was at Booking is that Booking has a very strong product culture. Like that model that I described of empower product teams, where you have a three-legged stool and together they're working to solve customer problems. I was sort of assuming that everyone worked that way because I'd been there for a decade and that I'd seen it work. Vista in pockets worked that way. So I set up my own team that way because it's the only way I knew how to operate. But there's large parts of the engineering organization that weren't working that way. There's part of marketing that weren't working that way. And so what I ran into was either marketeers who wanted to do things but had no hands. So they wanted to test things, but then they came to me and said, I want to test this. And I'm like, great. How do you do you know how to actually make that change on the website? And they said, no, we are not allowed to make that change. So, well, if you are not allowed to make that change, I can't help you run the experiment, right? And they're like, no, but you're supposed to be helping us run experiments. And so I had to go through this whole phase of explaining to people that you can only run an experiment on those things that you can already change, right? That the being able to sort of apply a treatment is a prerequisite for the ability to run an experiment on these things. And so where I've shifted my perspective is on like, how do we make more of the Vista teams behave like empowered product teams, where It's a little bit of marketing, it's a little bit of design, a little bit of engineering, and together they work on solving these customer problems. The same on the engineering side, right? The pushback you get in those cases is engineers saying, well, business told me to ship this, so I'm shipping this. So, and you're asking me to test it, but I'm doing exactly what they told me, right? And so you get pushback, not per se on like technically if it's not feasible. I could do it, but why would I? I already know what I need to build, right? And so there's just no desire in those cases because there's no incentive. Um, I think again I got lucky. Like at booking, I got lucky. Now again, I got lucky because I'm not the only person at Vista who believes that the empowered product model is the way to go. And so you can see that this organization is investing a lot of time and effort in actually building up this product capability and making these teams become more empowered. And I'm very happy to be sort of part of that larger picture. And so it means that from like when I hired Sarah and Kevin and sort of Flavio as the analytics lead, that team is now up and running, and I'm slowly going like stepping a little bit backwards, and I get to have a little bit of a broader scope. And I realize that actually it's the empowered product teams that need a lot of help, and that I happen to have that experience. So now I'm having a lot of fun sort of figuring out like how do I help them define what are the ceremonies that they need to be doing as an empowered product team? How do they work together? Like what are the things that we expect from a product manager? What does a product strategy look like? What does an opportunity solution tree look like? How do you do continuous discovery? Like all of these things that at booking were norm. Like all the teams were doing this. This was just like the ecosystem in which experimentation existed. And now at Vista, like my job is still sort of to help them run more experiments. But I don't think the bottleneck is the center of excellence at this point. I mean, there's things that the center of excellence can improve, and it can certainly make it easier, and that will sort of improve them single digit, double digits. But the real velocity needs to come from empowering the teams to build things in an isolated, like discover and build against customer problems in an isolated unit that is empowered to do these things without having to go to another business stakeholder and asking like, hey, is this what you wanted? Can we please get a stamp of approval that this is what you want to ship? Right? All of that stuff is slowing us down more than anything else. And so I'm really happy to see that sort of progression.
Yeah,
But it's
you
somewhat
need to
outside the
stand
scope.
up a powered product team center of excellence on the side of your experimentation center of excellence.
Well, I
Uh,
mean, I only learned like I don't know 6 months ago or so that there's this entire field called product ops that I had never.
yeah, marketing
Which is
ops, some of them
essentially the
ops,
same thing.
and product ops. Yeah, the marketing ops, product ops, all this.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
I was
DevOps.
reading some Marty Kagan stuff, and he's
Well, the
describing
DevOps.
product ops, and I'm like, that's what I've been doing.
Well, the
I just
DevOps
didn't know.
movement talked about this, and I got on that series of books from you. Actually, you recommended the goal, and then I went through all the way through to the Unicorn
Oh,
Project and
yeah,
the DevOps movement and stuff like
yeah.
that. It talks about all of this kind of stuff. Interesting. Thank you, Lucas. This is great. I wanted to be concise. I appreciate it. I took a bunch of notes.
Cool.
I'll kind of chop this up and like get some key takeaways out of it. This is exactly what I wanted. Thanks, man.
Neat. Thanks, Ben.